listening to Power Producers Shop Talk, where we are refining and redefining the sales game by equipping you with the tools you need to differentiate yourself in the marketplace.
Listening to the podcast is only going to get you so far. Why not take your game to the next level? Check out Power Producer Basecamp on killingcommercial.com today.
Tactical skills that'll help you provide deliverable value to your clients and prospects.
Want to have the sweet swag that we send out from the Power Producers podcast for your clients and employees? Check out policyt.com today.
And action items that you can provide to take your prospects and clients to the next level.
Want to create an online presence but don't know how to start? Check out crushingcontent.com. It's done for you, so all you have to do is show up.
This is Power Producer Shop Talk, production redefined. Are you ready to feel the power?
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Shop Talk, where we have another episode here with Mr. Kevin Ring, the lead analyst at the Institute of Work Comp Professionals. And today we're going to talk about something I think a lot of agents probably need some education on, to be quite frank, because I walk into too many accounts where things are messed up. And it comes down to the ownership, right? When you're dealing with a company, and specifically a business owner who's got a little bit of money, they more than likely have their hands in more than one thing. And I'm able to get a lot of information in Florida to see that stuff by going to the Department of State and doing a search by name to find every entity that is registered under those people's names, where they're either an owner, officer, or the registered agent. Many of them use an attorney and they're the registered agent, but I have a pretty good idea of what they have their hands in before I ever go in and meet with them. But that's not always the case. And there's some pretty significant ramifications from a workers' comp perspective when you have ownership of more than one entity, or you have ownership of an entity that has ownership of more than one entity. And then you start getting into filling out the ERM form. And I know people get confused with that, but it's something that's really, really important. And I have gotten deals done because other agents just simply haven't done it. And the thing that's scary about it is you're having people sign workers' comp accord forms that you filled out on their behalf, and they're saying no because you pre-filled it, that they don't have ownership of more than one entity or whatever else. And then all of a sudden you have a loss control survey person come in and they start asking questions, and you find out that, well, no, we're not just a retail location. We have a whole crew that goes out and pours decks around the pools that we sell. And then we have this other company that does, and it's like none of them really have any relationship in terms of operations to each other. So the owner doesn't think anything about it, but NCCI does. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Kevin, why don't you kind of lay the foundation and we'll just let it rip.
Yeah, I mean, you laid a really good foundation, and I want to reiterate the point that you just made, because, I often make the joke in workshops that, I'm sure no one in this class has ever done this before, but, some agents will answer questions on the application without ever asking the insured that question. And I understand why that happens, but that question about ownership in other businesses is important to ask, both for the reason that we're talking about today, but also if they want to work with you on the business that you're talking with them about today, why wouldn't they want you to work with the other businesses they own? So there's a sales angle to that question as well. But specifically with the experience mod, what we're talking about here is common majority ownership, and common majority ownership drives the mod. There's a little bit more to how this works in Pennsylvania, and there's an exception to what we're going to talk about in Georgia. But otherwise, across the country, across all the different rating bureaus, this is incredibly consistent. If a person or a group of people, or a company or a group of companies, or some combination of the two, have common majority ownership between two or more entities, those entities must be combined on the same experience mod. Not can be or should be or might be, but must be combined on the same experience mod. If I own a flower shop and a dynamite manufacturing facility, those almost certainly aren't going to be on the same policy, and there's no requirement that they be on the same policy, except in Pennsylvania. And even that's a little fuzzy, but there's no requirement they be on the same policy. It's the fact that we own a majority of both of those businesses. So as a simple example, if we assume that David and I share 50-50 ownership in a company, and then me, David, and Kyle own a third each of a separate company, those two companies must be combined on the mod. Now, some people would look at that and say, oh, well, but no one owns a majority of both, so they're not combinable. But remember, that's not what the rule says. The rule says that there's common majority ownership. And between David and I, we own more than 50% of both of those companies. Then there's also, the phrase more than 50%. What I'll hear from a lot of folks is they'll talk about 51%. Well, 51% is clearly more than 50%, but so is 50.1 or 50.5, right? It just has to be more than 50%. And it doesn't matter that Kyle is sitting over there as someone who's completely disinterested in company A. Because David and I own a majority of both, they must be combined. And people get concerned about this. Business owners will say, oh, well, I don't want those businesses to have anything to do with each other. I want to keep them totally separate. And, I get that, but the rules are quite clear, and the policy is governed by the rules. And I know that agents run into folks in these situations that just, are adamant that they don't want to combine those things. And you can't sign the ERM 14. You just have to make a decision at that point, about how much you want to keep that business.
Well, I think something really quick to point out, though, and I'm not advocating one way or the other on this, it doesn't mean that the two entities have to be on the same policy, right?
Oh, no, absolutely.
This is only for mod purposes. And I've seen people who argue, as far as clients or prospects go, argue it both ways. But if you're an agent, I just want to make sure you understand what Kevin's saying is you have to put them on the same policy, because that's not the case. That dynamite manufacturer likely isn't going to qualify for the same market as the flower shop is going to. And you may need to segregate that. And where we see it more often than anything else in Florida is they have two decent sized entities. Both of them are on separate policies with dividends. And their thought process is that they don't want the claims from one to possibly keep them from getting a dividend on the other side of the house. And I always say, well, I mean, if you're worried about having claims, why aren't we just worried about trying to avoid having claims? And, because if you aggregate the premium together, you typically qualify for a higher payout and a better dividend overall to begin with. But there are people, for whatever reason, well, my attorney said, well, great, but I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm giving you risk management advice, and they should stay in their lane as well. But I do see it. And sometimes you can explain it to people and they won't push back, but other times they just want to keep separate policies for whatever the reason may be.
Right. And sometimes it's possible and advantageous to have them on the same policy. And, like with my silly example, it almost certainly wouldn't be possible. And either one of those is fine. But what must happen is that the information must be combined on the same mod. And people will get concerned. Oh, well, this company has a bad mod and this company has a good mod. Do they get, quote, get that bad mod when they get combined? And I guess the way I would answer that question is that they get that experience, but they don't just get that higher mod. If you have a company with a 75 mod and a company with a 125 mod, and you combine those, it's a whole new mod that has all the information from both, and it's going to pull in the direction of the larger entity. It is not exactly a weighted average, but that's one way to think about it. If you've got, a company with $10 million of payroll that has a really good mod, and they buy a company with $1.5 million in payroll that has a bad mod, that $1.5 million in payroll is not going to blow up the $10 million payroll mod. It'll increase it, but it's not gonna ruin it. And a place where these rules really come into play, and it's probably one of the more common questions around this that I get from the agents we work with, is when your client buys another business. And when a business acquires another business, they also acquire their experience. And there is a list of, I think, 8 different definitions of a change of ownership of a corporation in the experience rating plan. But the 2 that are most relevant and make up almost all the cases that I see is they either just straight up buy the legal entity, or the more confusing one is that they only buy the assets of the company. And a lot of people will argue, oh, well, we only bought the assets, we didn't buy the company. And in many small and medium business transactions, the legal entity that the business exists inside of does not change hands when the company is sold. And there's a variety of reasons that might be. It could be that the current owner that's selling the company has plans for that corporate entity, and they don't want to pay their attorney to set up a new LLC. It could also be that the buyer doesn't want any trailing liabilities that may be connected to that entity, and they want to leave that behind, and they just take the assets and the employees. But when your client buys a company, then an ERM 14 has to be completed, and that experience gets combined. And it's really, really important that you talk to your clients about this proactively, because I have a feeling that everyone listening to this has had at least one experience where a client has called them and said, I just bought a company, add it to my policies, or I just opened an office in another state, can you add it to my policy? And the answer might not be yes, depending on what it is that they bought. And also, obviously, if your client is buying another company, that mod that they're going to be absorbing is going to impact their insurance costs going forward for a few years anyway. And I'm not suggesting that someone would bail out of a company purchase that they're considering because there's a bad mod. But I think of it more like when you're buying a house and the home inspection comes back and says the roof needs to be replaced. You don't necessarily bail on the deal, but you probably do include the need for that roof replacement in the negotiation of the price of the house. Now, with construction and things like oil field services, where it's very common for companies to be judged by their mod, whether or not they get business, that's critically important because if they buy that company and they have no idea that they're walking right into a mod that's going to be a problem for them, then they could have shot themselves in the foot, really, really badly. And of course, they talk to their attorney and their CPA before they buy a business. They need to be talking to you as well for this and a number of other reasons where their insurance situation could potentially get more complicated depending on what it is they're buying.
Well, and it's the gift that keeps on giving too, man. I mean, if you end up getting a mod increase that you weren't expecting, you're going to be stuck with it for a little while, and you probably would like to know that ahead of time.
Right. And while when you're sending applications to insurance companies and getting prices back, we all know that most, and probably at this point, all insurance companies aren't doing things the way they were done 30 years ago, where they just took the rate times the payroll times the experience mod plus whatever surcharges, and that's the premium, right? In the underwriting process, they have a black box that says we need X amount of money, to write this account, and then they use whatever levers they have, including, plugging the experience mod in to see if they can get to that number. But when a mod changes midterm, they can't change, in the states where you can offer credits and debits, they can't change those, midterm. And so if your mod goes up midterm because of a change in ownership, then, that's going to hit you, dollar for dollar during that policy period. And then, going forward, it'll be whatever it's going to be. Another place this comes up frequently is when there's a company out there that has just a really bad experience mod, and they have this idea of, oh, well, I can just start, Kevin 2 LLC, and I'll just move all my payroll and everything into that entity, and I'll just, start with a 1.0. And, for my money, this is the number one reason this rule came to be. However far back this rule originated, it's people dodging their experience mod that is the biggest concern. And the rules are very specific that if you have a successor entity that effectively takes over the operations of another entity, then that new entity takes on the mod of the old one. Now, some of you are thinking, and I know this because of how many times I've been asked it, is well, what happens if the client refuses, to combine their mod the way that they should? What are the penalties for that? And there's a rule in the NCCI manual that's called Evasion of experience rating, and it says that some entities or some businesses might take steps to intentionally avoid the proper application of an experience mod. Others might do things for otherwise legitimate reasons, legitimate business reasons that prevent the proper application of an experience mod. Regardless of intent, if the rating bureau discovers that you have taken intentional action to prevent the proper application of the mod, which is combining the experience the way that it should be, then the rating bureau, I'm paraphrasing, can do whatever they want. They can go back infinitely into the past and combine things, and carriers can charge additional premium and all sorts of other things that would penalize the business. Now, we've never seen one of our folks have a client get slapped with this, but I've had conversations with folks at NCCI about this happening, and it's largely what the stories I've heard have been, people just starting a new company, and somebody at NCCI notices that, hey, these two companies have the same address and phone number in our system, but they're separately rated. We're going to investigate what that's about. But there's some signals that NCCI is using some algorithms to look for unusual patterns in claims data that we've heard stories about, and I suspect that if they're doing that with claims data, there's no reason they couldn't do that with ownership data. And we all know that computers are far better at finding patterns than we as humans are, especially in massive sets of data like rating bureaus deal with.
So what do you say to the agent who says, man, I've tried to figure out how to fill that form out, that things like solving a Rubik's Cube blindfolded?
My approach to the ERM 14 is to trying to think how I want to say this. I start with the understanding of what the form is designed to do. And what the form is designed to do is not to tell NCCI, hey, these mods need to be combined. It is to give NCCI the facts of the situation, and I use NCCI as a proxy for all the rating bureaus. But it is to give the rating bureau the information to then make a decision about what needs to happen. And that form is set up for the most vanilla business transaction that could ever be. There's 3 columns, the company that's buying, the company that's selling, and then the combined company. And that's where I find a lot of agents get stuck, is that they're in a situation where it's not that cut and dry. Like, I talked to an agent late last year who insures a large chain of auto dealerships, and this auto dealership bought another auto dealership. That auto dealership was 3 separate LLCs for 3 separate car lots. They were taking in those entities. They were creating new entities and moving the operations in there, and then all of those entities are owned by the parent. And what we wound up doing, there's a box right underneath that 3-column table on the ERM14 form, and it says, insert details here. If you need more space, attach extra pages. And what we wound up doing was just writing a narrative of the whole story of what was happening. And then you fill out, the couple things about the EINs and the business entities and that kind of stuff. And then just send that in, and then let them sort it out. Like, the form is so rigid, and the transactions that get reported on that form are not. So don't let the form lock you in, right? You can just write, a letter or an essay essentially spelling out what happened. And as long as you include all of the relevant elements that are outlined on the form, you're going to be fine. And they'll call you if they need more information.
Yeah, I think it's I think this is an area where a lot of agents miss the boat. And I think the other thing is, we fall asleep at the wheel sometimes with our existing clients. Like, this should be a trigger in the agency management system or the CRM, that if you're going to add a new entity under and link it to the account or whatever, that it pops up and prompts and says, did you ask for the ERM to be completed? And look, I wish I could tell you that I've been 100% over the course of my career, but I know that I haven't been. It just seems like, with M&A activity being where it is right now, it's pretty susceptible to happen. I feel like I've run into more instances now than I have in the last 20 years.
Well, and it's something we've seen increasingly with M&A activity, and then as you wind up with this kind of pyramid org chart of where you have the parent company that owns companies B and C, and then B owns D, E, and F, and then on down. And that ownership all climbs to the top of the pyramid. If all of those entities have common ownership, tracing back to the parent, then they are all combinable. Now, there will be situations where there's an entity down the tree where, an outside person or entity owns a majority of one of those other companies, and that goes in a separate pile. And it can also get confusing. We dealt with something several years ago where an agent was working on a large chain of Mexican restaurants in Kentucky, and there were like 24 restaurants, but they all had different ownership. So one was owned by 3 different people, 2 was owned by 2 of those people in a family trust, and on and on and on. And there, you just gotta, crank up a spreadsheet and map it all out. But again, that's where, just feeding the rating bureau all of that information and letting them sort it out and ask questions if they have them. But of course, it's always better to have a real good idea of what's going to happen before you send in that form.
100%. What have we missed?
Oh, what have we missed? I'm sure there is something, but I think if folks walk away from this knowing that they need to ask that ownership question on the application, that they need to be talking about their clients, about communicating with the agent before they go through any sort of business transaction, whether they're buying something, selling something, whether it's all of their company or part of their company, because when you sell a piece of your company, the whole thing gets more complicated, and not being overwhelmed by that ERM 14. If they take those things away, they're going to be way ahead of their competition.
100%. And to your point earlier about them doing it to try and run from the mod increase or whatever, that was also long before PEOs. That's the other trick that they do now is to, instead of worrying about skirting NCCI, my mod gets out of control. Oh, we'll just jump into a PEO and let it get drop down to a 1 after 3 years or whatever else. Again, people, if they're not fixing the root cause of the problem, it's going to be back to where it was when they come out. So it's not a great piece of advice either. Just do the form. Call it a day. We're going to catch you guys next time. We're going to be back with more Kevin Ring next week. See you.